point. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Anastasia Mourogova Milin was the person that I said might stretch your brain a little bit when we started today's session. Anastasia is a global director and co-lead of capital and investments for Dark Matter Labs. She brings 17 years of corporate finance experience, strategically supported by knowledge of the commercial real estate sector. She helped to launch the first Canadian Schedule A impact bank, and under that mandate, she oversaw the conversion of 1.3 billion existing conventional real estate portfolio. She has also worked more recently with the McConnell Foundation's Solutions Finance Group. And in that position, she oversaw the first Canadian Solutions Finance Accelerator aimed at supporting the civic capital movement. At Dark Matter Labs, Anastasia focuses on building novel markets for a portfolio of civic infrastructure. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I really look forward to learning from you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure. And despite working for a global digital innovator, I do hope that the technology is with me today, and actually really wanted to appreciate all the and express my gratitude to all the organizers for how innovative they've been, considering that despite COVID being with us for 18 months, we still all struggle with ways to do this and can have a human connection and be able to stay engaged with this type of events without being able to be next to each other and actually have that feeling of just together exploring and discussing something incredibly challenging. So I just wanted to thank everybody. Please do put in comments if there's any struggles with the sound or anything. And I'll start my presentation shortly, but again, I just wanted to acknowledge how grateful I am to be here and how grateful I am to all of you for spending the time and truly dedicating your capacity to explore this incredibly important and yet rather daunting challenges that are facing us, that are facing all of us in Canada. I live in Montreal in Quebec, and for us, climate change, and for my family, climate change is as real as it is for you. And so the fact that we all come here and we don't have the answers, but we're ready to listen to each other and together perhaps move one step forward, I think is what it takes. And I'm grateful to be invited to this conversation and share a little bit of perhaps my expertise and wisdom as part of the role that I carry with Dark Matter Labs. So if you can bear with me for 1 second, I'm just going to make sure that I can share my presentation. Just a second, and we'll do this backwards. So please let me know, and now that I'm presenting, I cannot see all of you. So please, Scott, if you can let me know if anything is not showing well. But otherwise, I was hoping to, as much as I can in 20 minutes, give you an idea of a new approach that we're taking on essentially nature as a civic asset, and on nature being not only a liability on our balance sheet, but in fact in being a provider of incredible value entanglement, both as a direct revenue, but also as a potential spillover value that will stretch for generations to come. Now, before I go into discussing, again, this fairly interesting but complex structural approach, I wanted to talk a little bit about dark matter, not because I love talking about my organization, I do, but that's not actually the reason. The reason I wanted to speak about us is because a lot of these concepts seem very far-stretched. They almost seem from a different world. But in fact, at DM, we've been engaged at building this for the last 3 years. And we do work with stakeholders around the world that are asking very similar questions to the ones you asking yourself today. And it's individuals who are very similar to yours, in the sense of they come with very much a passion to do the right thing for the individuals who voted for them, who chose them to create a difference in everybody's lives, but individuals who also lack capacity, both human capacity, time capacity. And so this is not concepts that are unreal. This is concepts that are grounding. And I just wanted to give you that. So I wanted to speak a little bit about DM. So Dark Matter Labs, and I'll explain why the name. But essentially, we formed ourselves 3 years ago to focus on the great transition our societies need. And that transition is in response to the climate breakdown, but it's also in response to the technological revolution that either can prompt us to find solutions that don't exist, or it can pull us in a totally different direction. And we wanted to help go towards the path that will create positive effects in our lives. And so what we do is we aim to discover and then redesign and redevelop the very dark matter. So the dark matter that exists in the universe and that Vera Rubin and American scientists discovered in the 60s, that dark matter exists at the bottom of every single one of our institutions. It exists in our economic systems, political systems. And so we as an organization aim to not only discover it, but then recode it so that we can all have a more sustainable future for us and for the generations to come. And the reason I wanted to show this is because we are 65 individuals, but more importantly, we're 65 individuals around the world that each come from a very separate background. Some of us are historians, some of us are mathematicians, archaeologists, architects, individuals like myself that come from very corporate background. And we all speak different languages. In fact, very few of us speak English as a first language. We come from an incredibly diverse cultural perspective, religious perspective. And so what it allows us to do is to bring our voices together and create solutions that are real and that are not stuck in some box of thinking, but in fact, are actually trying to really add value to what's already happening on the ground in a local context. And one interesting thing about dark matter, and I found that to be quite unique when I joined, the organization has an approach that everything we try to bring externally, any type of idea or any type of prototype or proposal, we first try out internally. And so what that means is, in fact, we have a fairly thought through and unique theory of change, if you want to, but the way we organize ourselves, the way we think of our own missions within DM, be it real estate, be it natural assets, be it food system, the way every single decision is taken around that is very much in this recoded way. So the way we speak to each other, the way we discuss salaries together, the way we think through an idea, implement an idea, who holds the relationships, who is responsible for bringing the funding, all that is done in that decentralized, recoded way. And we try it out and see what the human impact is before we propose it externally. And so we're also an organization that's constantly self-discovering and learning. And so nothing that we do is set in stone, because we're constantly emerging ourselves. And I found that I've never met an organization like this. So I find it gives us credibility. And so before I wanted to talk to you about Civic Capital as something that could be considered in the context of drought and how do you approach a climate emergency and think of it as a systems structural solution, I wanted to show you how we've been doing it. And so how we've been able to find the solutions and engage with external stakeholders, because again, it's not about coming here and saying that we have a solution for drought. It's coming here and saying that together, you as the key individuals will be able to find the solution, but there's a pathways of how to do that. One of the pathways is actually designing an infrastructure product. So at DEM, we've partnered with Morgan Stanley and Google, and we've said that in this world, while structural solutions, as in system solutions around governance and economy are important, but you also need to have products, something that can actually be invested in and something that can then deploy the capital into actual projects on the ground. So Trees AI, or Trees as Infrastructure, is one of these products that we're developing. And what it simply is a digital platform that pulls in capital from different sources of investment, impact investors, pension funds, individual investors, and allocates it towards developing urban forests as sort of a wall of trees around cities. And so we're working with Glasgow, City of Glasgow in Scotland, Madrid in Spain, and Milan in Italy to actually help them create those solutions. They need them not because they're interested, but because they both have a climate crisis on their hand. And also the reality is that COVID has very much depleted all of those municipalities' balance sheets and revenue streams. And so they need carbon credits as a way to actually replenish their revenue streams. And this is a very sustainable solution for them. The other way that we've found is effective in actually building this novel infrastructure ideas is by working with cities and municipalities, just like this group here, but focusing, just like you're doing, on a very specific problem. So in the context of the Healthy Clean Cities, which is all around climate transition, but in fact, what we've done is come together to the table with municipalities, but also with different levels of government, with finance sectors, with very much community representatives, which is very key. And we've looked at the specific problems. So for example, in Sofia, Bulgaria, there's a real challenge that city is facing in that they need to retrofit their residential properties, and it will cost them 25 billion euros a year starting next year. So, and again, we're talking to a city that's been completely depleted because of COVID. And so how do you structure a solution around it? Where do you find the capital? How do you deploy capital? How do you make sure communities are not just being forced to implement a solution, that their homes are not just being retrofitted without their consent? So that's one of the examples. In Kazakhstan, we're working with the cities to actually focus on circular economy around waste management, because in fact, they don't have an infrastructure that we are used to here for the very basic waste management. So we are actually helping them find, to leapfrog and find an innovative solution. And so those are the examples, but again, that means working very much multilaterally with all the stakeholders and trying to create a win-win solution versus a net-sum game solution. And then the last approach is, and that's where it's important, is it often does take federal government, or at least the thinking at the federal government level, because a lot of the solutions, especially around nature, require a marketplace. And that marketplace needs to be built, which means that there is demand for the type of economic pathways that we are developing. That needs to be created from very much the intentional government level, from a regulatory perspective. And so in Scotland, for example, we're working with the government to create a market for what they call pitlands. Here in Canada, we call that wetlands. We're very much creating a solution so that in order to transfer the land from agriculture into wetlands, what is the actual economic model that will work, and what will the government need to do to activate that model? So now that I've explained a little bit for you the background, and again, what I wanted to show is not necessarily talking about DEM, but wanted to show that there are individuals like yourself and organizations around the world that are very much in a similar situation of being strapped for capital, being strapped for revenue, being strapped for capacity, and they're looking at civic capital as an alternative pathway because they just don't have a choice, and yet they have crises like drought or their own crises they have to address, and that the citizens around them are looking to them to address. And so, again, I've been very cognizant that in 20 minutes, it's hard to explain what is civic asset. In this case, I wanted to sort of explain that civic assets can have a multitude of definitions. Sorry, I can't hear it, but if there's any issues, please let me know if there's something, if there's any comments. Let me just switch for 1 second. So just wanted to make sure that if there's anything unclear, please let me know, or if you would like me to repeat or anything, or if the sound is not clear. And just 1 second. My apologies. So in terms of civic assets, as I was mentioning, in this case, nature is an asset that is not recognized on the balance sheet as such, is recognized as liability, but in fact, nature and the services that nature provides, such as water services, has an incredible ability to generate future value that's both cash and revenue rich, but as well value appreciation rich, and that's a potential that a lot of traditional assets don't have, because over time traditional assets such as streets or roads or buildings, they depreciate, versus nature, and especially when nature is done in a portfolio approach, when it's combined with other civic assets, actually increases in value, and the revenue goes not from a 1 to 2, but in a compounding effect, which is why the solutions have a potential. They just need to be structured in a way that they can be unleashed. And so the reason that we've thought of these civic assets, and the reason we said that civic assets are essential, is because civic assets inherently need to be financed differently from a capital point of view. And what we mean by that is that if you look right now at capital markets, and I mean, if we follow anything that's happening at COP26, or if we just follow any of the sort of announcement by private sector, there's a lot of commitment to put capital towards any type of climate emergencies or sustainable solutions, but there's no really talk about the fact that the capital itself needs to be restructured. But it does, and restructuring that capital requires a different type of assets that have features so that the capital knows how it needs to be restructured. Otherwise, we're restructuring capital for the sake of restructuring. And when we say restructure, so why would we need to do that? Well, if you look right now at the way, and we say capital, but investment is done, it's very much on the short term, and we're not even talking 20 years. I mean, most terms of investment is between 3 to 5 years. And so when we're looking at this investments for challenges such as drought, these investments are multi-generational. So we need to have the type of capital that's actually structured to be there for the next 30, 40, 100 years. It needs to be committed, and it needs to be not taken out of the system. And the existing capital cannot do that. It's just not the way its conditions are put together. The other challenge of the existing capital is that it's either publicly or privately owned, but there's no in-between where communities and stakeholders on the ground, so in terms of rural communities, we're thinking individuals who live there, individuals who work the land, individuals who actually know the quality of the asset, who know what is it that the land, the soil is capable of, what is it that nature can provide as the services. Those individuals have no ability right now to have any governance decision, any underwriting of the terms capabilities, because capital is not structured that way. Capital is provided centrally by either a bank or a pension fund or a government. So it's done from a top-down approach, when in fact the governance need to stay at the community level. And the third feature that existing assets don't have, and hence the capital that finances them doesn't have, is this ability to view assets in a portfolio way, so that you can look at their co-benefits and you could look at the value it creates. And in terms of nature, it's even more problematic in a way, because we cannot agree yet to how do we measure the co-benefits. Should they be measured? Which one of them should be left in, for example, units of clean air, or they should be left in a certain measurements, and which one of them should be monetized? And so the idea is that you start thinking about civic assets from a point of view of what are the features of those assets. So how would nature need to be structured as an asset class, so that the capital that finances it, the capital that you can then as a municipality go and look for and bring to the table, what would be the features of that capital, so it actually sets you up for successful solution, versus putting you into a vicious cycle where you will be indebted and in fact will create more harm to the balance sheet that you're stewarding, versus creating a potential value uplift. And so the reason that we propose it to be structured as a civic infrastructure is so that it has three components. It has the ability to be, so nature inherently, its timeline is a minimum of 40 to 100 years. And what's really important is that to unleash, for example, the possibility of the value generation by something as simple as a tree that can then have an ability to prevent some of the climate emergencies, that tree takes a minimum 30 years to mature. So if you structure in capital in a way that after 5 years that capital can be pulled out, then you will never be able to create a solution that's actually allowing you to maximize the value of what you're investing. So the capital not only has to be for a long period of time, has to stay there, which is why we call it deep capital, meaning it's quite a bit of investment upfront, and that investment stays there. The other feature is that the investment has to be inherently governed at the community. So that's what I mentioned before, but you have to have legal vehicles that have a right to steward the capital, have a right to create terms for the capital, and that very much see to the fact that the asset itself performs and does what it's meant to do, and that it's not extracted for another use. And then the third feature is that you need to be able to capture this co-benefits or the spillover value. And you have to, and this is where digital technology comes in, because you have to be able to do it in a way that's transparent. So blockchain allows us to do that, where we can see the formula of what we're capturing, and it's open source. Everybody can see it. Everybody knows what the value is and where the value is allocated. And again, what I wanted to do today is perhaps give you an idea of how you can then use these concepts and use these features to actually structure a solution, so that I'm not here to present a solution for drought. I'm here to show you what is the pathway possible, and then how did we, for example, at Dark Matter thought about a very real problem that's happening in a rural context, and how we were able to take the thinking that's happening outside right now globally to create a framework that works for Canada. So we've been working with, here in Quebec, with the location called Jardin de Napierville. And essentially what's interesting about this mandate, and I thought it was very relevant, is that that is often the case with how we work, is we didn't go looking for that mandate. It's quite the opposite. So the farmers from this area have gone to the municipality and to basically united the local municipal leaders to say that they have a real challenge in their hand, in that this area has the most black soil in Quebec region, and that black soil is being washed away because we have flooding as a challenge in Quebec, that black soil is being washed away at the rate of 2 centimeters a year. And yet we know that it takes 400 years of keeping the land as wetland in order to restore 2.5 centimeters of black soil. So we are losing black soil at 2 centimeters a year, and it will take 400 years to restore that 1 year worth of what we're losing. So we need to find solutions now. And on top of it, the farmers and the municipalities have thought of, well, not only black soil is important for the agriculture and the produce, but there's also an important component of the services that the soil produces, such as water services, the quality of water, the biodiversity that's really important and that has other values, and of course the carbon sequestration that is a direct revenue source for the farmers and the municipality. So if we find solution, we'll be able to bring all this value. But if we don't, then we have a reality of losing an incredibly viable agricultural space in Quebec. And just to sort of say how important that space is that essentially this location is responsible for 100 million of exports per year in terms of food exports and 2,600 jobs creation. And in terms of the sort of the produce for Quebec, it's 40% of our provincial food production. So it's not something that we can say is a small problem that could be solved, and we sort of pass it on to the next municipal leaders. It's something that needs to be done now, and the farmers are the ones who recognize that. And so as a result, what we've been able to do is come together and essentially create an economic framework. And this is where I'm more than happy to, during the panel discussion, to sort of go deeply into the ideas. But essentially, we propose structuring, and we call it a fund. I mean, you hear a fund as being sort of the most used finance instrument only because legally it's the most versatile finance instrument we have. In reality, it's a platform that you would have where you would, on one hand, bring all the stakeholders that can create regulatory landscape on the solutions. On the other hand, you'll bring the investees, and then you identify a portfolio of values that you can invest into, and you structure capital that way. And so what it's allowing in this case for black soil region is that it's allowing the farmers to find a way to collectively manage the land so that they can figure out which land they will leave for regenerative agriculture, which land they will use for carbon sequestration, and then which land will be transferred to wetlands for water services. And instead of going to municipality and saying that the municipality has to pay for it, now through this model, we essentially have private actors who are coming to the table, and they've seen this because of the way we've structured the model with those features I've described. They've seen it as a it's as an excellent product for their capital, because we are very upfront structuring the capital in a way that aligns with what they can then take back to their institutions and say that the risks of the institutions are well mitigated in that product. So I wanted to provide that as an example. And again, the reason I wanted to bring this is just to show you the potential of what can be done as a solution. I'll leave the discussion at this. Hopefully it was interesting for you.
Yes, thank you so much, Anastasia. I think I know I'm really intrigued to learn more. This is a new area for me, and we have a number of questions in the chat. I know we're a few minutes behind schedule, but thank you so much for sharing some of the work that you're doing, and again, challenging us to think maybe outside of the conventional ways of approaching natural assets and civic assets. In the interest of time, if you're willing to take 1 or 2 questions from our participants, I will get going. So we have a question. Somebody asks, what ideas might we consider to draw capital to central Alberta while also supporting watershed health and function? So if you're able to speak to that, that would be wonderful.
And this is where it becomes extremely important that we have discussions like this in a group like this, because again, every geographical area has its own particular context, and the priorities that exist for that geographical area and that exist for the stakeholders. So what we advocate often is that you structure, from a capital point of view, you structure a solution that's, for example, at the province level. You don't structure a solution at the local level, because the truth is, for the capital providers to be interested to come to the table and look at those solutions, there needs to be a size. And we do know that the challenge has the size of the capital required, but often if you start looking at the deployment, then the size becomes too small for the capital. One is to say that you often suggest you structure the solution at the province level, and then you bring in the stakeholders, and the question becomes literally analyzing the entire challenge from a point of view of where will the liabilities lie, and where will the reduction of those liabilities lie, where this potential revenue will lie, and with who will that potential revenue be, and what is and sort of mapping out the entire, what we call the downstream effect, so that if you're creating value by reducing a liability associated with drought, in fact, you're creating also quite a bit of value with the water management. So who is that affecting? And then how are you going to be able to measure that? It doesn't need to be monetizable. It does need to be measurable. And so that then becomes a question of data. And if the data already exists for the sort of the cause and effect, then that makes the life a lot easier. If data doesn't exist, that's where you have to come in and decide, okay, how do we incorporate that? What is it that we're going to say will be the outcomes? And then around that, you start structuring a financial solution.
Thank you so much for that answer. In the interest of time, we're going to take one more question. Just to let you know, we are recording all of the questions that have been entered into the Q&A, and we will have an opportunity to get to those later, and I think throughout the day, and will also be on our panel this afternoon. So Marie Welch asks, how do you suggest that we reverse the perceived valuation of natural civic assets as being a value versus being a liability? That's a great question, Marie. Over to you, Anastasia.
I wish. The truth is, there's so much discussion that needs to happen around this. And this is where you have that equilibrium about, on one hand, we need to start deploying capital towards the solution. So there's not lack of solutions. The lack is there's a misalignment between solution, capital, and what's seen as the appreciation in value versus a liability versus an expense. And so there's this equilibrium that we need to maintain, because the solutions exist, the capital exists. Tying the capital to the solution in the fastest way possible is what's on one hand needed, but on the other hand, every time you do that, you set a precedent. And if you set a precedent from for example, the way you monetize the solution point of view, that creates negative precedent, you end up hurting going forward solutions. So you end up saying, well, we need to buy time and discuss, for example, the accounting standards, the regulatory standards, so that we don't create a precedent that will then be, again, essentially that will lead to extraction. And so this is where it is an equilibrium, and that's where a lot of frustration, for example, at COP26 is, where it would be so easy to say, let's create a digital token that's essentially monetizing everything, right? And that all of a sudden every biodiversity value is monetized, everything that's produced is monetized. But we know right away there's going to be negative effects to that from an extraction point of view. So that's why we carefully saying, well, maybe not everything should be monetized. Maybe certain things, and that's why I mentioned, for example, maybe clean air should stay as a unit of clean air, and we trade that as a value rather than associating the right of someone buying clean air and being able to put that on their private balance sheet. So this is where, again, and it's a balance that's really hard to strike, and there's frustrations on both ends, but this is why there's that tension, and we will get there. It's just a question of, can we all sort of say that it's a priority to get there, and then bring this type of groups together so that we have a discussion.
Well, thank you so much for that. Yes, as I said, I think there's a lot of information that you provided that we will be thinking about for the rest of the day and probably far beyond that. Thank you so much, Anastasia, for your presentation. We really appreciate you being here despite the time difference. I will now pass it over to José Mito again, who will introduce the next segment of our showcase.